Hey Rob, so welcome on Christmas Eve. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this. At least you're not in your scrubs.
No, I've got a t-shirt and I haven't shaved, so
There we go. Okay,
there's a little
so
festive.
so let's get on with the next section in the series.
Okay, so the last time we spoke, I spoke in more of a practical way to help people to understand what it is that they need to do to combine diet and addiction management into kind of one philosophy to make that approach a lifestyle approach. The part of the problem with initiating anything new is understanding why I'm actually doing it. And I understand the weight side, I understand the diabetes side, but there's so much more that's interconnected and interrelated. And you get defenses and demonization of carbohydrates and defense and demonization of fat. And there's so many misconceptions. And I think that in order to sort out beliefs from science, we need to look at some of the pathways and the processes that happens after we put food in our face. One of the biggest, if you're going to remember anything from this talk, it is very simply this statement, and that is that the human body does not work in a very simplistic way in which the stuff we put in our face, the stuff we eat and drink, automatically appears in the body and is either good or bad for us. The human body does not work in that way. And the very thing that got us into trouble in the first place is something called the lipid heart hypothesis that was promoted by people like Ansel Keys from very, very weak epidemiologic data which is a multi-country study that they did. I didn't even give a number to it, but the simplistic philosophy that completely altered our diet for the worse was this: that when you do autopsies on people's bodies who died of heart attacks and strokes, you see buildup of fat and cholesterol in their blood vessels. And the simplistic logic that the doctors of the day used was that, it must be the fat that we're eating that is clogging our blood vessels. From that one simplistic hypothesis, which we now know is absolutely wrong and has never, ever been factual, we have created this whole universe of false science to support a carbohydrate-dominant metabolic advice, which is called the food pyramid. And all of the metabolic issues that have emanated from that, and that are the prominent diseases that as a society, come from that single misbelief. So the statement is this: that we need to get away from the simplistic concept that what we put in our face causes health or disease, because the human body is very adept at processing things, and it's the consequence of the process that causes harm or benefit, not what we directly put in our face. So what I'm going to do today is use multiple examples of the common diseases, at least now, that weren't that common before, and help you to understand how all of that works. So let's start with the biggest one, literally and figuratively. Let's start with obesity. And I'm going to simplify this down. There's obviously, you can make it as complex as you want to, but I'm going to simplify it down and give you the skeletal structure of this. Obesity or weight gain, it has some biologic value. For example, bears that hibernate in the fall can eat a super amount of food. And in the old days, when human beings were going to the fall or the autumn, they also had access to certain foods that would provide them with a little bit of extra fat, even though they didn't hibernate, to go through the tough winter months. Now, our society has changed, but that's one of the reasons, for example, why fruit is seasonal, at least in nature, and you've got about a month or so where you've got fruit that is high in carbohydrates that you can eat to add a little bit of fat. But the way that the accumulation of fat is regulated, it's regulated primarily by two hormone systems. Ghrelin is a hormone that exists in the stomach, and there's a couple of others that insulin-like growth factor that are associated with that cause hunger. So when your stomach has been empty for a long time, ghrelin gets released and you get hunger. If you eat a natural diet, in other words, a diet from nature, which typically has a fairly high fat component, when you eat fat, the fat cells, in response to that consumption of fat, release a hormone called leptin, which is our feedback hormone that goes through the bloodstream and gives us a sense of satiety. Leptin is primarily activated by fat, so that it allows human beings normally to have an ebb and a flow. So we eat something, we use a little bit of it, we store the rest, and then we feel full, and we feel full for a long time based on leptin. And between meals, we use that store. And when that store is depleted, ghrelin levels go up, and we eat again. So there's this continuous ebb and flow. It's called homeostasis, which is this balance that the human body creates. The problem is that with a change in our dietary philosophy away from fat and toward carbohydrates, carbohydrates have zero leptin activation facility. So you can eat carbohydrates in way excess amounts calorically than you can eat fat. So a calorie is not a calorie. A fat calorie has profound effects in the human body that restrict its consumption. Carbohydrate calories have no feedback mechanism. So therefore, the human being themselves have to decide how much they're going to eat and when they're going to stop. But it's almost unlimited. It's exactly the same as water and alcohol. Both are fluids. When you're drinking water, as soon as your thirst is quenched, you stop drinking, and there's no incentive to overdrink. When you're drinking alcohol, the endorphin value of that alcohol easily overrides the stopping point of hydration management. And therefore, you can drink alcohol in excess of what you can drink water. Exactly the same thing happens with carbohydrates. It does not happen. It does not happen when you consume fat. And the principle of the ketogenic diet is to remove carbohydrates and add fat without having to restrict caloric consumption. If you don't need to restrict your calories, and yet weight loss is about reducing calorie consumption, then you allow your body to do that on your behalf. And the two principles are you eat less and you eat less often, and over time you lose weight. That's the simple principle of the ketogenic diet. It is the only diet out there that does not specifically restrict caloric consumption or portion size. So that's the way that works. Now, it is exclusively chronic excessive carbohydrates, however, that drives obesity, because again, it's unregulated. So that's how we become fat. It is not the consumption of fat. It is not the consumption of protein. The consumption of protein may slow down how quickly you lose weight, but it doesn't cause obesity. So the driving force behind obesity is primarily an endorphin response that comes from a drug, not a food, a drug called carbohydrates. Little segue here. The concept of a drug has three aspects to it. Number one, it provides pleasure. Number two, it is not necessary for the human body. And number three is that excessive consumption is possible, and excessive consumption over time causes harm. The consumption of fat and protein does not do that, but the consumption of carbohydrates does. And that's why in the ketogenic diet, and as the principle of this talk series, we focus on carbohydrates as being the enemy, not by themselves, but in chronic excess amounts. So let's look at the consumption of carbohydrates as they flow through the body. The first thing is it doesn't matter how you put the sugar in your face. The world out there loves to tell you there's good carbohydrates and bad carbohydrates. That is absolutely not true. Because, for example, if you put an apple in your mouth and you eat a bowl of ice cream, what enters your bloodstream is exactly the same amount of sugar. And it's that sugar that causes the problem. So don't think that there are good carbohydrates or bad carbohydrates to put in your mouth, because by the time the intestine is done with processing them, it has broken that starch or that sugar into individual molecules biochemically called glucose, fructose, or galactose. But let's call them glucose. And it's the glucose that enters the bloodstream. And it's both the rate and the amount of glucose that starts to cause problems. Now, biologically, how should your body work? Well, when you are a normal person, you eat a little bit of carbohydrate, gets broken down to glucose, glucose enters the bloodstream, and very early in the entry of sugar into the bloodstream, the sugar stimulates the pancreas to produce a hormone called insulin. And insulin's job is to get very rapid removal of that sugar, of that glucose, from the bloodstream. Most of the sugar goes into the liver and into the muscles. So that's how the body empties the bloodstream and distributes the sugar out of the bloodstream. Because as you'll see in a few minutes, elevated levels of sugar in the bloodstream are extremely damaging to the human body and are the dominant cause of many of the illnesses we currently have. But let's take this pathway through. So let's focus primarily on the liver. You eat the sugar causes the insulin level to go up. Insulin drives the sugar into the liver. The liver is the center of the metabolism. the liver will always store a little bit of that sugar as a thing called glycogen. Glycogen is a storable amount of sugar in the liver, and it is there for rapid response. So, for example, if you walk around the corner in the old days and there's a saber-toothed tiger, you've got a rush of sugar into the bloodstream, which gives you the immediate energy to try to run away from the saber-toothed tiger. That's kind of the example of, so it's an immediately available in the liver, and the liver will always retain some glycogen. Once the glycogen stores are full, and glycogen in the liver is available at peak activity for about 10 to 15 minutes of physical activity, up to about 600 grams. The rest of the meal, the rest of those calories get converted by the liver into fat. They then get transported either in the bloodstream as triglycerides, which is mainly the transport of fat that comes from sugar, or in what's called we call it now cholesterol bodies, but they are actually transport molecules that are combinations of protein, cholesterol, and fat. The common one that we know is LDL, who transports the fat from the liver to the fat cells. Okay, that's the principle by which food gets processed when we eat it. And then between meals, the liver at first uses the excess glycogen it's stored. So if you're walking around, if you're doing just carrying on with your regular life and you're not eating, the liver has to continuously supply the bloodstream with energy, and it starts out by using that glycogen. And then when the glycogen stores are depleted to a certain amount, it then taps into the fat cells and transports fat from the fat cells to the liver and to other organs in the body, where that gets used as a source of energy. And when your fat stores are depleted, your leptin levels go down and you eat again. So there's this ebb and flow. Now, how does that go wrong? Well, the first thing is when you eat a high concentration of carbohydrates, your blood sugar goes up very, very high. And what happens is the liver extracts a huge amount of that sugar under the influence of insulin, if you are still sensitive to that insulin. And it stores a little bit as glycogen, and then it manufactures fat. But the transport of fat from the liver to the fat cells is not as fast as the liver produces the fat. So the fat builds up in the liver cells. What's that called? That's called a fatty liver, or NASH, N-A-S-H, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And almost all Americans who eat a regular diet have a component of a fatty liver, because there's a mismatch between production of fat by the liver and transport to the fat cells. Now, if you cut carbohydrates out of your diet within 72 hours, and we prove this every day when we do surgery on patients, you can get rid of fatty liver. You can immediately, very rapidly get rid of fatty liver. It is directly and exclusively caused, non-alcoholics, in other words, not caused by alcohol. It is exclusively caused by chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption. The other problem in the liver is that for some people, the type of fat that collects in these liver cells, it's kind of like a conveyor belt that hasn't moved out, can cause inflammation of the liver. And that's where your liver damages, and it can cause fibrosis and eventually cirrhosis of the liver because of that inflammation. And that's work I did in my PhD about 15, 20 years ago, where we demonstrated exactly that effect. So the primary cause of cirrhosis and fibrosis in America right now is not due to alcohol, it's due to carbohydrates. So that discusses fatty liver. However, the way the liver protects itself from this excessive pathway is it slowly over time becomes less and less sensitive to insulin, which means that the massive uptake of sugar into the liver doesn't occur anymore. So what happens in the human body is, as your liver becomes resistant to this perpetually increased amount of sugar in the bloodstream, the liver becomes resistant to small amounts of insulin. And as the liver becomes resistant to insulin, your blood sugar slowly rises, and the pancreas has to produce more and more insulin to force the liver to work. And that's called insulin resistance. In the first stages, a high amount of insulin can still keep the blood sugar relatively normal. But over time, the body becomes more tolerant, or the liver becomes more tolerant to a rise in blood sugar. And it's that rise in blood sugar that causes damage. So even in insulin resistance, you start seeing damage to your blood vessels and to your body even before you call diabetic. But let's go through this. What happens is every molecule of glucose is attached to a molecule of water. That's how it gets transported in the bloodstream. So you've got this little glucose water molecule. And that molecule very rapidly goes into the cells that line the blood vessels. They're called endothelial cells. Those are the cells that are like fried eggs that line the blood vessels. Think of them as kind of almost barriers on a highway road. So they allow the traffic to run smoothly, and they're nice and flat. What happens is, as the sugar and water goes into those cells, a flat thing can't store a lot of volume. So those cells slowly turn from being fried eggs to being boiled eggs. They round up. And when they round up, they fill, number one, they fill the lumen, or they make the lumen of the blood vessel narrower. And that, of course, puts pressure back on the heart. So you've got the lumen that is narrower, and you've got this excess of water that is retained in the blood vessel by the sugar. So you've got high volumes of water, hypervolemia, high volume, and narrow vessels, which then causes the heart to have to pump super hard and super hard. And when the heart is pumping hard, your blood pressure goes up. That's called hypertension. And most of the doctors out there who don't understand this process call it essential hypertension. We don't know what it is. We don't know what the cause of the blood pressure is. That's absolutely not true. The majority of Americans have high blood pressure, even if they're considered to be normal, not on medication, because of their consumption of sugar. And eventually it reaches a high point where the doctor now has to start treating it. And they say, oh, we don't know what it is. We'll call it essential hypertension. That is completely false. Essential hypertension occurs in very, very few people. We truly don't know what it is. This is carbophiliac hypertension. It's volume and sugar overload hypertension. And if you treat the sugar, if you get people to stop eating sugar and starch, stop eating carbohydrates, that hypertension goes away or improves dramatically. And you do not have a progressive disease. You can actually put hypertension into remission, and we do it all the time with our patients. Now, secondly, what happens in those blood vessels is not only do those cells round up and compress the lumen, when they separate to round up, they leave little gaps. So think about me punching a hole in the wall behind me. The wall over here is nice and smooth. If I punch a hole in the hole, it becomes rough. That's exactly what happens in the blood vessels. And those are injuries that are happening all the time in a normal human blood vessel. And we've got a clotting system called the endogenous clotting system, or the intrinsic clotting system, that recognizes those little damages and forms a little plug. It's called a fibrin, or a little fibrous plug that plugs that hole. And then the human body normally seals that, and off you go. However, if that hole is not sealed rapidly because these cells are still swollen, then in come platelets, in come white blood vessels, and they form a stabilized clot. In the very, very small vessels of every human organ that is provided with blood supply, from the brain to the toes, in the capillaries, those tiny blood vessels, those clots form, and the clot over time coalesces or joins together and blocks the lumen. Okay, so think about a traffic jam, then everything builds up behind that. But the problem is the little cells of your organs downstream are not getting food, and they're not getting nutrition or oxygen. So those cells begin to die. They become dysfunctional and they die. And it affects every single organ in the human body. In the brain, we start getting progressive brain death. That's called Alzheimer's. In the eyes, we get diabetic retinopathy. First of all, a buildup of extra blood vessels to try to circumvent this, detour it, and then eventually you get blindness. In the heart and the lungs, we get heart attacks, strokes, heart disease, lung disease. We get liver disease, we get kidney disease, often ending up in dialysis. We get erectile dysfunction in men. We get lack of blood flow, particularly to the peripheries of our legs, so we get black toes. We start getting amputations. All of those diseases, while they are individual diseases, the collective cause of them is chronic excessive consumption and insulin resistance diabetes. But note, I haven't mentioned the word diabetes yet, because those diseases begin to happen. And the death of those small organs, or of small bits of those organs, begins to happen when your body becomes resistant to insulin and your blood sugar starts to rise. Now, what happens at the biological level, at some point, for everybody, you reach a maximum insulin production capacity where the pancreas cannot produce any more insulin. And then if the liver's resistance is even greater, and you continue to eat sugar or carbohydrates by mouth, then you reach a point where you can't produce insulin to force that sugar out of the bloodstream, and it builds up tremendously. And when that blood sugar goes to a very high level, and that level is maintained, it even damages the little blood cells, the hemoglobin in your red blood cells that are transporting oxygen. And the glucose gets attached to that hemoglobin. And what do we call that? Hemoglobin A1C, which is the number we use to measure diabetes. But diabetes, that measurement of hemoglobin A1C, is actually damage to red blood cells, the first measurement of damage to the human body. And as your hemoglobin A1C goes up, then you reach a certain level by which the doctors out there call you diabetic. Now you've got type 2 diabetes. Not because you're not able to produce insulin, but because the body can't react to the insulin. And that type 2 diabetes then gets treated. But before you become a diabetic, that insulin resistance is still causing damage to the human body. And that's what most people out there don't understand. And the illogic of that is, I'm fine, I don't have diabetes. That's not true. The damage is still being done. So if you understand that, a large number of the diseases that we have occur because of the mechanics of that process. But remember, the other thing that happens is there's inflammation of those little clots. Those platelets and those white cells become activated, and they cause inflammation. Why is that important? Because I describe diabetes as being a microvascular or a small vessel disease. But what happens in the bigger vessels? So you've got a huge big vessel. The same process is happening. The issue is not so much the balling up or the rounding up of the endothelial cells. The issue is that little gap, that little exposed gap. And what happens in that exposed gap is the little blood clot forms, but because you've got chronic exposure to insulin, to sugar, it doesn't heal up. The way the body heals up, remember I talked about punching a hole in the wall? The way you come along to patch that hole, you bring plaster and you plaster over the wall over here to smooth it over. In the human body, we've got a very similar plaster mechanism. The plaster substance that the human body uses to stabilize those clots is called cholesterol. So along come those transport molecules that should be transporting cholesterol and fat from the liver to the fat cells back and forth, called LDL. Now what the LDL is doing is bringing some of that cholesterol and some of the proteins that bind the cholesterol to the blood clot to form a stable layer. And that is the association between damage to blood vessels and LDL. LDL is just the transport molecule that's bringing the cholesterol there. And the more damage you have, obviously the more LDL you need, so the more transport there is. If you've got a small house fire, you might have one fireman. If you've got a big old building ablaze, you've got lots of firemen. The LDL is like the fireman at a house fire or a big building fire, okay? So don't blame the LDL for the problem, but that's what the world out there does. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Nevertheless, what happens in those blood vessels, let's say in your heart or in your brain, the little cholesterol plug forms and it stabilizes the clot. But the clot starts to increase and increase, and because of the inflammation, those clots rupture and it releases a little plug, a little clot plug downstream. Now remember, these are big blood vessels, but big blood vessels branch and they narrow. And eventually that little clot plugs a big blood vessel suddenly. So now suddenly you go from lots of blood flow to that heart or that brain to none. And immediately there's no oxygen to the heart, there's no oxygen to the brain. That bit of heart and that bit of brain dies. What's that called? It's called a heart attack and it's called a stroke. And the majority of Americans will end up dying of heart attacks and strokes, which is a direct consequence of chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption, insulin resistance, and diabetes. That's called CMOD, which is the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity and diabetes. Okay? Our predecessors 70, 80 years ago thought of those blood clots being caused by the fat. All they could see was the fat and the cholesterol in those plaques. And yes, that fat and cholesterol plug did break off, but it did not come from the consumption of fat. It didn't come from the consumption of fat, because when you eat fat, the liver stores that as fat. The fat doesn't build up in the liver. It doesn't cause blood sugar to rise up. It doesn't, when you're eating fat and you're not eating carbohydrates, there's no injury to those endothelial cells. So you don't form the clots in the first place. That's called normal. And normal doesn't cause that injury. So when you're on a high-fat diet, there's no buildup of sugar in the blood vessels. You get no endothelial injury. You get no blood clots forming. You do not get this injury. But our ancestors, in terms of dietary evolution, thought, oh, wow, we're seeing the fat in these clots. It must be the fat that we eat that's being deposited there. That is not true because the injury doesn't exist. So that completely debunks the lipid heart hypothesis. Okay, so this whole branch of cardiology and of medicine that surrounds lipid eating fat, and that fat is so bad for us, and that fat causes all these problems, and we have to put you on a ton of medications called statins to reduce the amount of fat in your bloodstream. That's absolute garbage. That's absolute garbage. Okay, first of all, it's not the consumption of fat that causes the injury, as we've just explained. Fat does not cause any change in endothelial cell function. Secondly, fat very rapidly gets transported from the liver and directly from the bloodstream and gets taken up in the fat cells, which is LDL, the transport molecule. So yes, when you eat fat, your LDL is going to go up. But the other point that I haven't yet made, and it's important, is when you convert sugar to fat in the liver, a lot of that fat gets transported free in the bloodstream as a substance that we measure called triglycerides. And triglycerides are associated with a high carbohydrate consumption and are a far better measure of damage to the blood vessels, because you know that the triglyceride elevation comes on the back of carbohydrate elevation or glucose elevation in the bloodstream that is causing the damage. So when we test lipids in patients, we typically look at a total cholesterol, we look at HDL, which I'll come back to, we look at triglycerides, and we look at LDL. But the cardiologists and the doctors out there blame the LDL because when your LDL number goes up, it means that there's injury. But it's not a cause of the injury, it's an association with the injury, because the LDL is transporting the fat the cholesterol to plug up those holes. So there's no harm there. When you eat a lot of carbohydrates, the association with increased carbohydrate consumption is an increase in triglyceride production. So the best measure of injury when it comes to fatty products of the liver, of the blood vessels, is your triglyceride count, because triglyceride elevation is associated with elevated carbohydrate consumption. As soon as you stop eating carbohydrates, as soon as you go on a low carbohydrate diet, literally within 3 to 4 weeks, your triglyceride number comes way, way down. And it's the triglycerides that are most commonly associated with heart attacks and strokes. Best predictor. And if you can reduce your triglyceride count, you're in great shape. However, the paradox is that actually your LDL numbers stay the same or even go up. Why? Because LDL is the molecule that transports the fat that you eat back and forth from the liver and the fat cells. So you can expect that to go up, but it's not a dangerous thing. And I know it's difficult to understand this all, but it's so important for physicians and even for human beings to understand what the relevant numbers are. That's critically important. So really what we look for in healthcare in terms of health is a lowering of triglycerides and an elevation of HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, but that's the molecule that actually takes cholesterol and everything else away from those plugs. I'm not even going to go into that. That just confuses the matter. But you want to see your HDL go up, your triglycerides go down, and your LDL stays the same or may go up a little bit, but it is no longer associated with disease. That, again, is called the CMOD model, the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity and diabetes, which is the true scientific basis of all of these diseases that the lipid heart people, the people for our nutritional ancestors from the 1950s, used to explain the buildup of fat in our blood vessels. It was an erroneous concept, and yet we've developed this whole science around it. So what do we do now when people have an elevated cholesterol level? We put them on statins that blocks LDL. Can you imagine saying, hey, all these firemen around the fire is a bad thing, and taking all the firemen around a house fire? What's going to happen at the house fire level? The house is going to burn even more vigorously. And that's what statins do. So when the marketing people, the pharmaceutical companies, and they've made billions of dollars off these medications, when they market or a doctor tells you that you need a statin, they do not tell you that you need the statin to lower your risk of a heart attack or a stroke, because there's no data to support that. They can't say that. What they do say is, oh, these statins will lower your LDL level. And yes, they do. And they allow you to make the assumption that that's going to improve your heart attack and stroke risk rate. But it doesn't. It does not. There's no evidence to support that there's a significant improvement in heart attack and stroke risk on statin. But there is absolute evidence that 7 to 10% of people who start statins and they get told to eat less fat automatically eat more sugar, and 7 to 10% of those patients become diabetic in the first 5 years after statins. And we know that the diabetes causes the damage. So in fact, in the majority of people on statins, we actually see an increase in heart attack and stroke risk rather than a decrease. So the statins have no value. If you're going to take any medication, you really want to reduce the inflammation of those little blood clots. And the single best drug to reduce inflammation, which blocks platelet inflammation, and this comes from my PhD, and the word is it's a thromboxane A2 inhibitor, is a simple, dirt cheap little drug called aspirin. And a baby aspirin a day, a baby aspirin every other day is the single most therapeutic direct treatment of those blood clots. But nobody sells that, nobody pitches it, because as a doctor, I'm never getting a rep for aspirin in my office because aspirin's too cheap. But we get the statin reps coming in all the time because they make so much money off selling that drug. So if you understand the biochemistry, you can understand what's best for your health. Don't take the statin, take the aspirin. But the most important thing you need to do is get rid of the sugar and the starch. The low-carb, high-fat diet is the way to go. So that's just talking about obesity and the lipid heart hypothesis. But let's take sugar a little further in a more sophisticated way. The next issue with sugar, and really we're talking about the rise in cancers, for example, breast cancer rates have increased in exactly parallel to the increase in obesity and diabetes rates. They have to be connected, and they are. Because 100 years ago, breast cancer was a relatively rare cancer, and we're seeing this as the #1 killer of women right now. Okay, so why are these cancers becoming so big? Why is rheumatoid arthritis and the autoimmune diseases increased? Why is thyroid disease, the autoimmune thyroid diseases, increasing so rapidly? Well, that is mediated through inflammation. So we've got autoimmune disease, we've got inflammation, your painful joints and things. And I'm not an expert on this, so I'm going to give you my agricultural understanding of it. There are better experts in this particular field, but here's the way it works. There are two types of fat molecules. There are two types of fatty acid chains. Think of a fatty acid chain as kind of this molecule that just goes up and down, and it's linked with simple carbon molecules. The word saturated means that there's only a single bond. So you've got two single bonds, or a single bond and a single bond linking each other. And that molecule, even though it's very, very long and very big, is incredibly stable, and it's nice and soft and fluid at body temperature. That's the saturated fat, okay? When we use the word unsaturated, it means that there's a double bond. So instead of having a carbon and a carbon, you've now got two carbons and two bonds forming. So think of this, and these two things are almost like magnets that you put together. They're very unstable. They don't like to be together. They become a little bit, they're soft at room temperature, but at the human body temperature, they vibrate and they cause this problem. And in the cell membranes, remember, every cell membrane of your body, every mitochondrial membrane of the human body has this double layer of lipid chains. So think about these fat molecules being the wall, kind of in like an ocean, being the wall of every cell in your body. So now you've got these unstable, unsaturated bonds. And when those bonds do this, they rupture. And when those bonds break, they release peroxide, hyperoxide, all of the things called oxidants. And if you look at what's so popular, all the antioxidants, oh, this thing's an antioxidant, this thing. Well, that is to counteract those things that they tell us are antioxidants are there to mop up the release of those oxidants. So oxidants get released primarily from double bonds that break. And the more double bonds you have in a fat molecule, the higher the risk of inflammation, the higher the risk that these bonds are breaking. So in saturated fat, there are no double bonds. It's an incredibly stable fatty acid. In the mono-unsaturated bonds, you've only got one double bond, very unlikely to break, and that fat molecule remains fairly fluid. In the polyunsaturated, PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acids that come typically from heating up fats to extract them. So your seed oils, your canola oils, all of those oils are very high in polyunsaturated fat. And the polyunsaturated fats have a lot of double bonds. When they get put into the cells, they are very unstable, they rupture, they create inflammation. And in every organ in the human body that has cells, inflammation can occur from that response. Now, what happens is sometimes that inflammatory response activates in the mitochondria some of the genes. So, for example, the Angelina Jolie genes, the HER2/neu and the BRCA genes, those are just names for them. Those are pre-programmed cell death genes. So your cell will divide a few times and then it dies. In cancer, the cell stops dying. So it just grows and it just divides and divides and divides and divides. That's what the simplistic version of cancer is. And what happens is the inflammation affects the programmed death genes so that those cells do not die, and that's what a cancer gene is. And the HER2 and the BRCA genes, simplistically, are the genes that are programmed cell death. So when they don't work anymore, now you've got no restriction and you get these tumors developing. That's really the principle, and inflammation damages those genes. So when you've got cells and cell membranes, we've got a lot of this pro-inflammatory breaking of those molecules. That's where you get the injury. You also get the injury in, for example, platelets, where I did my work. When those platelets become activated in those little blood clots, they attract other white cells and other cells that are floating in the bloodstream to form a superclot. And it's that superclot that breaks off that causes our heart attacks and strokes. So it's an inflammatory disease. So inflammation becomes something that affects blood vessels, it affects cancer, it also affects autoimmune disease. A lot of the rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, not be all and end all, but a lot of those diseases have a significant component of this polyunsaturated fat instability. Now, that's when you eat polyunsaturated fat, it gets used up that way. It gets modified slightly, but ultimately those fatty molecules occur that way. But that is actually a relatively small production of polyunsaturated fat in our cells. The overwhelming amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids comes from the conversion of sugar to fat. When the liver converts sugar to fat, it produces a high volume of polyunsaturated fats that are free in our bloodstream in the form of triglycerides that get plugged into these fat cells when they get, sorry, not the fat cells, that get plugged into new cells when they're developing to form their membranes. And it's that instability of those membranes that causes inflammation. So that's a direct link between carbohydrate consumption, polyunsaturated fats, and inflammation that then causes the cancers, the autoimmune diseases, and other inflammatory diseases. See how that works? So if you reduce your carbohydrate consumption or remove the carbohydrates, you remove a significant cause of inflammation. And while I'm not an expert on this, it has significant effects on the brain as well, where you start getting into seizure disorders, into other disorders that there are better experts than I can explain, but that's the process. So again, it's the carbohydrate insulin model of inflammation that extends to a lot of the diseases that we cause for ourselves. And the best, not the perfect way, but the best way that you can mitigate against that is to reduce your consumption of carbohydrates. So there's so many biological advantages, but let's take this a little further, okay? Let's talk about a very common disease that almost all Americans are diagnosed with: low vitamin D levels. Oh my God, vitamin D. Well, what does vitamin D do? Vitamin D helps to build bones and retain calcium in bones. So it helps with our bone structure. It's got a number of other functions in the liver, but vitamin D is essentially something that helps with bone growth, bone stabilization. And when your vitamin D levels go down, your calcium metabolism changes. Okay? So yes, we need vitamin D in our diet. There are 4 essential vitamins: vitamins A, D, E, K. K, by the way, is to do with the clotting cascade. But you've got A, D, E, K that are called fat-soluble vitamins. When you eat food that contains vitamin A, D, E, K, it doesn't get absorbed unless it's mixed in with fat. So the way the gut absorbs some of the fat is in bile, and that bile gets actually absorbed into the lymphatic system and enters the bloodstream kind of up in your neck where it enters the bloodstream. That's how most of your fat-soluble vitamins enter the bloodstream. If you take a vitamin D without food, or if you eat a low-fat food, even though there's tons of vitamin D in the regular food that we eat, if there's no fat, you don't absorb it. So this has nothing to do with carbohydrates, other than if you're eating carbohydrates, typically you're not eating fat. But then what does the doctor do? They put you on vitamin D, and they give you tons of vitamin D, but you're just pooping it out. It's of no value to you because you're not able to absorb it. So ADEK requires fat, whether you're eating as a supplement or just getting it from your food, and there's tons in the food. You have to eat it with fat to get the maximum absorption. Now, let's go to a slightly different place, okay? As much as cholesterol has been maligned, cholesterol is an essential component of human function. It's a critically vital molecule in the human body that has a lot of functions. And we actually produce cholesterol in our body for a variety of purposes. So the consumption of cholesterol is never an issue. The consumption of cholesterol is never an issue because the liver processes it very well. But the liver does produce cholesterol. And there's no such thing as good or bad cholesterol. There's only one cholesterol molecule. Okay? It's what happens with that cholesterol molecule that causes the damage. So when cholesterol goes to blood vessels to patch up holes, it's associated with damage. But it doesn't damage us automatically. When you produce cholesterol and you excrete it into your bile, and remember that cholesterol production increases with carbohydrates, you get gallstones. But more importantly, cholesterol is used as a precursor for a number of hormones. So the way it works is the liver produces cholesterol, and then cholesterol gets transformed via a variety of enzyme pathways into something called cholecalciferol, which I'll come back to in a second. It gets transformed into estrogen and certain testosterones. So a lot of the sex hormones have a cholesterol as a precursor, okay? Now, there are multiple enzyme pathways that take it down those pathways to the sex steroids or to cholecalciferol. Insulin blocks the very first step in the conversion of cholesterol downstream. So if you're insulin resistant or diabetic, even if you don't have diabetes, those insulin levels that are always elevated block the conversion of cholesterol to, let's say, estrogen. What's that disease called? That disease is called polycystic ovarian syndrome. That is a form of infertility. It's a form of dysfunctional uterine bleeding. It is a very common disease that a lot of our adolescent females have. And the problem is, as soon as they come off a low carbohydrate or go on a low carbohydrate diet, their fertility rates go through the roof. And in my practice, 12% of our fertile adolescents get pregnant in the first year after they go on a low carbohydrate diet because they believe they're infertile. They sit on a warm toilet seat and they become pregnant because nobody ever has any sex. But the point is there that your fertility goes through the roof. And that is the cure for PCOS. The doctors out there won't tell you that, but what they will do is put you on a drug called metformin, which alters insulin sensitivity to try to treat PCOS. Well, metformin is a diabetes drug. You see how they're all related? When it comes to cholesterol to cholecalciferol, why is cholecalciferol an important thing? Cholecalciferol is vitamin D. It's that plus the vitamin D that we consume forms the active complex. Well, if you're not producing cholecalciferol, no matter how much vitamin D we have, you're not able to use it in a biological form, so it's useless to you. And of course, you need sunlight to activate that as well. So the three components that we need is vitamin D absorption, cholecalciferol, and sunlight to be healthy. You don't have to take a vitamin D pill. If you organize things that way, you go for a 10-minute walk in the sun instead of having, let's say, pasta for lunch, you're fixing the vitamin D cholecalciferol bone problem. And guess what the disease is that almost all women have, especially peri and postmenopausal, is osteoporosis. Well, vitamin D prevents osteoporosis and the calcium metabolism pathway. So all of those things are interrelated, okay? Let's go back to another thing. We as human beings, as a species, have been chasing salt our entire existence as a species. Salt has been a very precious commodity. The salt mines, the salt caravans, we've always chased salt. Why? Because salt is a vital molecule for human survival. Salt basically regulates human blood pressure and human blood volume. All of the systems that regulate blood pressure, the renin, aldosterone system, all function around salt. When you pee, you don't pee water. You pee salt and the water chases the salt. When you sweat, you don't sweat water. You sweat salt and the water chases the salt. So salt retention and salt excretion is the way the human body is designed genetically and biologically to manage blood volume, okay? So salt is a necessary component of the human body. And when your sodium levels, which is sodium chloride is salt, when your sodium levels are high, your magnesium, your chloride, your potassium, your calcium levels are usually protected. When your sodium level is low, the body has to use magnesium, potassium, and calcium as an alternate. And that's where those levels become dysfunctional. So as long as your sodium levels are good, you're good. Now, why has the world turned against salt? Well, again, our nutritional ancestors, when they started promoting a high carbohydrate diet, remember I said when you eat sugar, when you eat that glucose into your bloodstream, every molecule of glucose is attached to a molecule of water. Well, guess what? That retains a huge volume of water. So we have to drink continuously to supply enough water with the sugar that we're eating. So the whole concept of, oh, you've got to drink 8 glasses of water a day, you've got to drink 64 ounces of water a day, just that overhydration comes from the principle that sugar retains water. And it does. So it retains it in the blood vessels, which causes the hypertension as well. And the way the body responds to that, the only way the body can respond to the sugar water retention is to pee out salt. So by definition, every obese, every carbohydrate dominant person is sodium deficient. They don't have enough sodium. But the human body has no mechanism to regulate the water that comes on with sugar. So we build it up, we become hypertensive, we've got this massive volume of water we're trying to pump around our bloodstream. And if that's not enough, then the fluid goes into our endothelial cells and goes into our tissues, and we swell up. We get those swollen legs, but every organ in our body swells up. And that swelling of the tissues damages the tissues as well. So think about a pregnant woman whose ankles swell up. Almost all my diabetic patients have these massive swollen ankles because they're secreting water. It's called edema or swelling in the tissues. And all the organs get swollen. Not only do the organs in the ankles get swollen, but when you're lying down, you're not standing up. So the water doesn't go to your ankles, it goes to your neck. And when the water swells those soft tissues in the neck, they swell closed. What does that lend itself to? Sleep apnea. Okay? So you get sleep disturbance because you can't breathe normally. That's from swollen tissues in the back of your throat. And what do the doctors do? They give you a CPAP machine to force the air by. Why not just get you off sugar and get that swelling to go away? So even relatively skinny people who are carbohydrate dominant and have some of that genetic soft tissue there can have sleep apnea, but it's much, much more common in obese people. So in my obese population, I assume they've got sleep apnea, but it goes away even before they lose a mass amount of weight. So you see how all these things are interconnected. And that's through through glucose retention of the water. So one of the critical things I tell my patients to do right when they start coming off sugar is to add a ton of salt to your body. Add a ton of salt to your food, drink broth with salt in it, don't go low sodium. And one of the reasons we see something called the keto flu, where you get constipation, you get headaches, it's hypovolemia. There's not enough volume in the body because you don't have the salt in your body to retain that fluid. If you eat the salt retains the fluid, and any excess fluid will get peed out. So your edema goes away when you've got a high salt volume. Your headache doesn't happen. Your poop doesn't become constipated when you have enough salt on board. And yet every doctor out there will still tell you, oh my God, the salt is bad, the salt is bad, the salt is bad. The other point is that salt by itself does not cause a significant amount of hypertension or increase your heart rate. Heart rate goes up slightly if you're really salt dominant, but it doesn't affect you in a negative way. It is the combination of salt plus sugar that is harmful. But salt in replacement to the sugar is the way the human body was designed to function. So you see how all those misadvices come from the fact that we were telling people to eat more sugar. The next thing that's associated with all of this is we force people to drink so much water. You got to drink 8 glasses of water a day. You got to drink 60. Well, you know what, Doug, I think you know this. On the plains of Africa, there just isn't that amount of water. So it was necessary for our ancestors in the cradle of evolution to have had that much water. We would have been extinct as a species. It's absolutely not true. If you look at some of the first world people who eat very low amounts of carbohydrates, they drink very small amounts of water, and the urine is usually pretty concentrated because urine is there to pee out solutes. It's not there to pee out volume. But in the modern world, we're using our urine to pee out water, which comes along with sugar. That's not the function of the kidney. So the kidney is overworking because it's dealing with all this water. The kidney should be getting rid of little molecules, and it flushes it out with a little bit of water. But our urine should be dark and small amounts, not black, but relatively concentrated and small amounts every now and then. And our volume consumption can go way, way down. We need a little bit of fluid. Very often now on a ketogenic diet, when I'm not eating carbohydrates, I'll go for a run or I'll do some workout. I'll come back, I won't even need to drink. When I was running on sugar, I'd have to sit there and chug water throughout the race as well as afterwards. So again, homeostasis. So we've got to understand that, because if you're drinking too much and you're not eating sugar, you're flooding your body with too much water. Your salt can deal with that for a certain extent, but it's not necessary. So that becomes a very, very important aspect of this. Now, let's go back to another disease that is going through the roof and affects every family out there, or the majority of families out there with young children. And we're going to talk about two diseases. We're going to talk about ADHD and attention deficit and attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. And we're going to talk about autism spectrum disorders. Now, this to a certain extent is relatively uncharted territory, but there's a lot of information about this. When a woman gets pregnant, that fetus, that baby, is subject to already at a biological level developing systems that are based on the behavior of the mother. So, for example, when the mom gets really stressed out, her stress hormones, her cortisol and her adrenal hormones go up. That's what happens when you get stressed. And guess what? That spills over to the baby. So the fetus feels that stress hormonally. And then whatever the mother does to calm herself down, to deal with that stress, to dissipate that stress, gets imprinted. The word is imprinting, gets imprinted on that fetus. So, for example, if the mother has a really rough time and she goes for a long walk and she paints, or and she goes for a walk, or if she turns on some music and she starts bopping to music, and those hormones go away, the fetus associates endorphin management with music, with physical activity. Or if the mom is all stressed out and comes home and eats a tub of ice cream and her blood sugar goes through the roof, the fetus associates relaxation, endorphin release from that molecule. If mom is stressed out and she has a smoke and the nicotine spills over into the fetus imprints a pathway of emotional management, of emotional relaxation on that behavior or that drug, which can either be healthy or bad. Even though the child, the baby isn't necessarily going to come out of the womb and look for a cigarette, as soon as that baby, when it's born, is then exposed to that behavior or that drug, it already is imprinted with an association of, wow, this makes me feel better. So when that 8, 9, 10-year-old kid has access to cigarettes, they're far more vulnerable to becoming a smoker down the road. If they were calmed down with music, they're far more likely to enjoy music as a source of relaxation. And if they were calmed down by the mom eating ice cream or a carbohydrate, as soon as they're exposed to rice cereal in their formula, to Cheerios or to mac and cheese, not only do they have a biologic, but also an endorphin releasing association, and they have a higher propensity to become carboholics, become carbophiliacs, and use carbohydrates at a very young age to deal with their emotional needs. So they build up this relationship with readily available carbohydrates, and the commonest or the highest incidence of obesity in our country, in the United States right now, is occurring in 2 to 5-year-olds. 2 to 5-year-olds. Partly because our parents are exposing them to those carbohydrates, but in large part because of imprinting. And that's a critically important thing. So you've got to understand that as a pregnant mother. Now, let's look at the autism spectrum disorders. Well, the way the human brain develops and what makes us human is that about 65% of the human brain is made of fat, of saturated fat and cholesterol. So, but that doesn't just get made by the human body, because there are certain fatty acids that we have to consume, we can't make internally. So for adequate brain development, both in the fetus as well as in the young child, and remember, human brains are unique in the animal world, that the human brain continues to develop structurally for the first 4 to 5 years of life. Because if the brain was as big as it is at full formation, human moms wouldn't be able to give birth naturally through the birth canal. The brain would be too big. So evolutionarily, what we've done, most animals are born with their fully structured brain. Humans are not. Humans' brains continue to grow for the first 4 to 5 years of life. So the human fetus typically is exposed to adequate amounts of fatty acids because it pilfers them from the mom. But sometimes that doesn't even happen if the mom is on a high carbohydrate, ultra low fat diet, because biologically that fat may not be available. But as soon as that baby's born, if the baby's fed breast milk, it's getting the best sources of fat. And then if you continue to feed that baby a ketogenic or a low-carb, high-fat diet, it continues to develop its brain adequately, and the structure of the brain develops. It may not be the smartest child, that's genetically predetermined to a certain extent, but it's not going to have structural issues with the brain. And for the first 4 to 5 years, it is critically important that that baby gets fed a high content of saturated fat in its diet. whether it comes from milk or meat or wherever it is. You can't get adequate saturated fat from a vegetarian diet. What happens if you raise the baby on a high carbohydrate, low fat diet? Mom can't produce breast milk or chooses not to, feeds the baby a high carbohydrate formula, adds rice cereal to that, weans them onto mac and cheese and Capri Sun and apple juice, sugar, 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 no fat. The structure of the brain doesn't develop. And autism spectrum disorders are problems with brain structure. Because think of the brain structure as this white matter, as highways that pass messages back and forth across the brain. And there are different centers of the brain that have to have coordination. Well, if the highways are damaged, if the highways never developed, you can't get those messages going across. So the forebrain doesn't connect with the high brain doesn't connect with the temporal lobe. The brain structure is disabled. And that is, in large part, the evolution of the autism spectrum disorders. And while it's not the be-all and end-all, it's a huge contributor to this massive increase in autism spectrum disorders. If mom, when she's pregnant, eats a decent amount of saturated fat, and as soon as that baby is born, feeds the baby a decent amount of saturated fat, you radically reduce the incidence of autistic type disorders. No magic to that. Now, on the other side of that, excessive sugar in the bloodstream causes hyperactivity. The guy that first discussed or described hyperactivity disorders about 60, 70 years ago, in conjunction with the rise in sugar in our diet, made this statement just before he died. And I think his name was Dr. Williams or Williamson. I don't recall it, but you can Google that. And he made this statement: if children do not eat carbohydrates, they are unlikely to have attention deficit or attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. It is the consumption of carbohydrates in chronic excess in our children that is directly related to ADHD and ADD. Think about that, okay? So one of the final concepts that I need to address as part of a change from eating a high carb, low fat diet toward a low carb, high fat diet is, what about protein? And protein kind of gets left out of the discussion a little bit in the ketogenic diet. And I think it's a critically important thing because there's still this tremendous fear out in the world out there of fat. There's still this lipophobia. So while more and more people are understanding that carbohydrates are not a good idea, what they often promote as a replacement for carbohydrate consumption is protein consumption. And while proteins are critically important to human biology and to human nutrition, we really don't need to eat a large volume of protein, and we have to understand what happens, why protein is necessary, and also what happens from a dysfunctional perspective when protein is misused. So let me take you down this pathway. The majority of people out there, in the world out there, still believe that protein is a primary source of energy for the human body, and that's false. That's not true. It is counterproductive to think that my muscles are a primary source of energy. My fat is my primary source of energy. But it is true that protein is my backup source of energy, okay? So what you always want to do is to try to protect your backup source of energy. And when we eat protein, a small amount of protein, through something called the Krebs cycle, through something called the through gluconeogenesis, will get converted to sugar to maintain your blood sugar. But that's a tiny fraction. It's about 5 grams, less than 1 level teaspoon of protein goes to sugar in my whole body right now. It's a tiny amount to support my blood sugar, and that's one of the reasons why it's safe not to eat carbohydrates. But the change in our thinking is that protein should not be primarily thought of as a macronutrient, as something we primarily eat for energy. It's something that we primarily need to eat as a micronutrient or to support the functions of our body. If you're an athlete or if you are someone that does a lot of physical work, you need protein to repair and rebuild tissues. But even if you're relatively sedentary, protein has a primary role in tissue repair and tissue building. But protein is also a primary hormone, and protein is also, in large component, an enzyme that creates a lot of functions in our body. And if you're using all your protein as a fuel source, it's deficient for tissue repair, tissue building as a hormone and as an enzyme. But also, when too much protein goes into the macronutrient pathway, goes into this thing called the Krebs cycle, the excess protein results in the buildup of molecules that cause damage. And I think it's critically important that we understand these, because I've seen a lot of patients in my practice who try the ketogenic diet but aren't eating enough fat. They ramp up their protein consumption and they don't protect that protein. I call it protecting the protein with fat. In nature, almost all the protein that we have has fat associated with it that allows the protein to go down the nutrition pathway and the fat to become your source of energy. But when you produce energy from protein, the first thing that happens is certain chemicals in that cycle build up in excess. So, for example, one of those that builds up is oxalic acid or oxaloacetate, which is a byproduct of protein breakdown for fuel. And oxalic acid goes into the bloodstream and can filter out in the kidneys. And when it filters out in the kidneys in significant amounts, it forms little crystals and eventually forms kidney stones. So those kidney stones become a problem, and also the excess excretion of those protein byproducts can definitely harm the kidneys. So a lot of the doctors out there that don't understand the ketogenic pathway will blame the ketogenic pathway or the type of ketogenic or high-fat diets for causing kidney damage. It absolutely doesn't. It's when you eat protein in an unprotected fashion, when you're eating a low-carbohydrate, high-protein diet, that you do get renal damage. But when you protect that protein with fat, then the fat enters that Krebs cycle and a small amount of protein goes down the nutrient pathway. You don't get kidney damage. In fact, you get kidney preservation. So that's critically important. But here's, when you look at the folks out there that talk about oxalic acid, what they do, and remember I said this at the beginning of this talk, what goes in your face doesn't necessarily cause harm in your bloodstream. It's because it all gets metabolized. So what a lot of the people out they will talk about with kidney stones, they'll say, oh, don't eat your leafy green vegetables like your spinach that have a lot of oxalic acid in them, because that oxalic acid gets filtered out in the kidney and causes. That is absolute garbage. It doesn't do that. It doesn't do that. Yes, you absorb that oxalic acid. It has function, but excessive vegetable material does not cause kidney stones. It's the protein that does. But what they do is they measure it in a test tube, they measure it in the lab, and they say, ooh, this going in your mouth in excess must cause damage. Just like the lipid heart hypothesis people said, you eat fat, it clogs up your blood vessels. So that's one byproduct of lean protein eating that's harmful. The other one that's harmful is gout. We get a lot of people that start the ketogenic diet and they get rid of the carbohydrates, but they increase their protein consumption. And the breakdown of certain proteins, certain amino acids, release purines and pyrimidines, which are important in human biology because they are helpful for our genes, for gene expression and to build the genes in each cell. However, when those purines get released into the bloodstream and together with the breakdown products of protein, they form uric acid. And uric acid filters out in the joints and forms little crystals that can then damage the joints and cause gout. When you're not using protein as a source of energy, as a macronutrient, then the protein becomes that nutritional element, fat becomes your fuel source, you're not breaking down and creating all this uric acid, and you do not get gout. So actually, a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet is a cure for gout. It's a cure for gout. But a low-carbohydrate, high-protein diet is a cause of gout. And it's so important that people out there who are advocating for a ketogenic diet help people to understand this. There are so many evangelicals, and I love them, that they promote the ketogenic diet, but they don't quite understand the ratios and the science. And it is so important that we understand this so we don't abandon a ketogenic or a low-carb, high-fat diet because we didn't quite understand what it was and ate too much protein. If you can protect every bit of protein you eat by either consuming it with fat or what I call fat fortification, adding mayo, adding olive oil, adding cheese, adding avocados, adding eggs to your protein, the protein is going to be pushed primarily down the nutrition pathway, and you're going to use that fat as a source of calories in the Krebs cycle. You won't get these protein-based diseases. So it's critically important to understand that, but also separate yourself out from what goes in your mouth causes harm directly. It doesn't work that way. Now, those are all, I've taken you down a journey of so many biological things, so many diseases that we as human beings are coping with right now. So if you think about where modern humans are, we've in large part solved infectious diseases, which were the commonest causes of death 50 to 100 years ago. And we're becoming safer and safer as a species in terms of trauma and traumatic deaths. Those were the things that happened to us in terms of death. Okay? What the commonest causes of death and illness now in human beings are what we are doing to ourselves. Alcohol, nicotine, carbohydrates, opioids, all of the substances that we use for emotional management are the primary causes of our diseases. If we can develop a more effective emotion management system that we raise our children with, where their vulnerability to using those addictive substances and understanding the harmful nature of those addictive substances goes away, guess what? We're going to have a group of people that are less trauma, that die less of trauma, less of infectious diseases. Our cancer rates go down. All these diseases that we just talked about today, rates go down. We as a species are going to become healthier, more effective, and be able to live not only longer, but healthier for a long period of time. It surely is incumbent upon us to address this from a substance level, but also from an emotion management level. And the next chapter that I'm going to talk about, the next discussion, is all going to be about breakdown and dysfunction from an emotional management system perspective, and how human beings have discredited and not placed emphasis on adequate emotion management skills and tools and the development of that, because we're so focused on success and achievement. And then we use drugs, highly toxic drugs, that have infiltrated our world and us as a species over the last 100 years as the way to dysfunctionally manage those emotions. So if we can correct that at our children and within ourselves, then as a species, we're going to be so much healthier and so much better.
The magic pill, isn't it Pete Evans is the guy that did that?
Yeah, yeah.
So he did, there's a couple of instances there where they took families with autistic children or something and took them off carbohydrates and saw massive improvements in their functionality.
Right. So there's two parts to autism. There's the actual disease itself, which is a structural disease that you can't fix. But then a lot of autistic kids have hyperactivity on top of it. So, for example, the Ernie Els Center, which is down in Jupiter, it's a big autism because he's got an autistic kid. Right. And he's donated massive amounts of money to develop this autism spectrum disorders clinic. They treat their kids. And a lot of the kids have seizure disorders. They treat them on a low carbohydrate, high fat diet, but it reduces the hyperactivity of the kids so they can focus a little bit better, but it doesn't prevent the structural deficiencies. If you feed that fetus, and you see the problem is...
So in other words, it improves it a lot.
But doesn't get rid of it.
But it doesn't get rid of it. The way to not have it occur in the first place is to have to feed them
the fat
from infants.
Right. And the problem is that's a very difficult study to do because you don't know who has the probability of becoming autistic. Right. You know, you can't go backwards. So, but the right thing to do is to do a study where you take, and nobody's going to do this study, but you take a group of pregnant women and you feed them a low carb, high fat diet, and you take another group of people and just treat them the normal diet. And by volume, you should have two similar populations. And then you just look at the number of patients or the number of kids that 5-10 years later have a diagnosis of spectrum disorders. Now, there's other things that factor into this. There's the behavioral side and all that kind of thing. But at least then you can look at the structure of their brains with MRIs and that kind of thing. So, these are all hypotheses with a lot of evidence to them, but they're not proven yet. But hell, let's face it, autism spectrum disorders are going up like this together with obesity and diabetes. And there is a plausible scientific explanation for it. Yeah. I might be wrong, might be right, but it's very plausible. Tim Noakes talks a lot about this as well. And there's no harm to be on a low-carb, high-fat diet. So why not? And there might be harm not being on it. Right. So why not be on it?
You go on it and you at least see some improvements. And I think that's a thing with cancer as well, that it's seems to be that you can get a lot of improvements, sometimes even, a remission out of just cutting carbohydrates out of your diet. But I think most of the experts will agree that if you had to not ever have eaten carbs in the first place, that the chances of actually developing it in the first place may be significantly
right. And there's so many historical studies that when you look back at the native Indians in the US, you look back at the Bushmen, there's no cancer in those people. And yet, it's not because they're not living a long time. We just see so little cancer as a disease entity. And if you look at what they're eating, it's very little carbohydrate. So yes, it's an association. But and then we look at cancer rates even in modern Americans. 70 years ago, cancer rates, apart from lung cancers, were very rare. Breast cancer was even in medical school when I was training, nobody really talked about breast cancer because it didn't exist. Okay, now it's the commonest cause of death of women. Okay, it's in terms of cancers. So we've seen, and the only thing that's really changed is the increase in diabetes, obesity, and carbohydrate consumption. So the statistics are there, the scientific process is there. So it's incumbent upon us to do that social experiment. Remember, they did a social experiment with the removal of fat without any evidence to support it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot. You see, like you say, it might be associational, but it's a lot of evidence.
Right.
So
there's a ton of evidence.
It warrants further investigation.
Correct. But also it warrants us, if we could stop eating fat as a society because somebody said it might have an influence, and yet we've dramatically changed our diet and removed fat from it because of an assumption. With all the evidence we now have of carbohydrates, surely it's incumbent upon us to, the best experiment you can do is not to do a study, but do a societal study where you remove carbohydrates. And if you can remove those carbohydrates and change the philosophy of people to carbohydrates like we did with fat, and you see massive improvements, because that's what the fat experiment was about. It was, okay, if we remove fat and we're right, we're going to see improvements. Well, guess what? We didn't. So therefore, we have to abandon that philosophy. Because it's fun, but we still cling on to it. Okay, that's the madness.
The undertaking to try and.
Well, you know the way to do it though, Doug, is to do it at a microcosmic, at a community level. So if you can get certain communities, especially politically, if you can get regions or a state to adopt this, it becomes, for example, the UK is beginning to adopt some of the stuff. So even the Noakes movement in South Africa is changing certain people's perspectives.
Right, and that's one of the things that they're doing is that that Eat Better South Africa program is that they're actually taking literally communities, like a little community, and kind of changing the way that entire community eats, and then tracking the improvements.
I mean, even if you can just increase the awareness that sugars are bad, because people it's subtle, but it slowly grows. And lipophobia didn't just happen in a day. They scared the shit out of people with heart attacks and strokes, but it took 20 years to evolve. From the 1950s, Ansel Keys studies in 57, and before that to 1977 was a long period of time. Okay. And it was really based on fat removal and then not intentionally adding carbohydrates to the diet. So now if we do the same thing, it might take 20 years, but it's going to have a significant influence. And I think more and more this movement is doing that. But the problem is we're too focused on obesity, which is the least important issue. It's the most visible, but the least important. We're under-focused on all the diseases I just talked about today. Because there are very, very few doctors out there that are going to make a direct correlation between someone's carbohydrate consumption and their hypertension. They're going to talk about salt all day long. They're going to talk about all this all day long. They're not going to talk about carbohydrates. And we need to get doctors speaking more and more to people who are diagnosed with diseases, whether it's cancer, whether it's hypertension, whether it's diabetes, talking to them about carbohydrates. And what we have to do is help people to understand. Because, I'm a little bit fatter today, but that doesn't bother me. But when I get diagnosed with blood pressure and I'm put on a blood pressure medication, or now I have to take my diabetic medication, that scares the shit out of people. That diagnosis is a very, very valuable time to intervene. And it's a sudden time to intervene. And if you can intervene with having this little discussion with them about any of those disorders, okay? The infertility doctors, their offices are full of people with PCOS. And now they're doing artificial insemination and all that kind of crap on them, bypassing the problem. The problem is they're not producing eggs properly. So all of those things, if you can just sit down and say, look, here's a mom, somebody wants to be a mother who's desperate for having a child, and she's going to see the infertility doctor. If the infertility doctor said, hey, dude, cut out your carbohydrates. Yes, we'll go take you down the infertility pathway, but get rid of the carbohydrates. They're going to have 1 or 2 or 3 kids. And so those are powerful places to impact. Obesity is the worst place to impact because fat people don't care.
But that gets the most attention though, because
of course, but it's treated with a diet. It's calories, and quite frankly, everybody's overweight. I'm overweight, so overweight has become normal. Someone like you is actually on the anorexic spectrum, in this country. Whereas 50 years ago, you were normal. My favorite movie is Casablanca, and in that movie, you would be considered slightly overweight in Casablanca. Okay, there's one fat guy. If they were to, but in every scene, somebody was either drinking or smoking or doing both. And you've heard me talk about this. If they were to reshoot Casablanca now, everybody would look like me or fatter, but nobody would be smoking or drinking. Everybody would be eating donuts. And it's just our society's evolved, and we don't believe that that's a problem. We see that as normal. In the 1940s, smoking and drinking was normal. And, I remember going in the 80s, going on rounds with doctors, and we'd have a smoke break after every ward we went on. At lunch, I would be able to have a beer or a glass of wine with my meal, because we still softened those problems being an issue. When I was growing up and you were growing up, there were ashtrays everywhere. Try to find an ashtray now.